whose father was a carpenter while his mother was a waitress. But nobody ever imagined that one day he would become the famous painter and television host we all know today as Bob Ross. But how did Bob Ross become such a renowned painter and television host? And why did he become a painter and television host? What was his life like before fame? Is it true that part of his left index finger was missing? Was Ross really once in the military? Was he a fan of country music? And how did he pass away? It's time for me to answer all these questions and more, since this is ASMR. Aaron, back at it again with another daily video to help you relax. So lay back and enjoy the ride. I hope this read helps you get you through your day, or even better, I hope this video helps you gently fall asleep. I can't wait to get started. This is the tale of Bob Ross.
Ross was born in Daytona Beach, Florida, to Jack and Ollie Ross, a Cherokee carpenter, and a waitress respectively, and raised in Orlando, Florida. As an adolescent, Ross cared for injured animals, including armadillos, snakes, alligators, and squirrels, one of which was later featured in several episodes of his television show. He had a half-brother, Jim, whom he mentioned in passing on his show. Ross dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. While working as a carpenter with his father, he lost part of his left index finger. This minor disability did not affect the way he held his palette while painting. In 1961, 18-year-old Ross enlisted in the United States Air Force and was put into service as a medical records technician. He eventually rose to the rank of Master Sergeant and served as the first sergeant of the U.S. Air Force Clinic at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska, where he first saw the snow and mountains that later became recurring themes in his artwork. He developed his quick painting technique to create art for sale during brief daily work breaks. Having held military positions that required him to be, in his own words, tough and mean, the guy who makes you scrub the latrine, the guy who makes you make your bed, the guy who screams at you for being late to work, Ross decided that if he ever left the military, he would never yell or raise his voice again. During his 20-year tenure with the U.S. Air Force, Ross developed a taste for painting after attending an art class at the Anchorage USO Club. He found himself frequently at odds with many of his painting instructors, who were more interested in abstract painting. In Ross's own words, "They'd tell you what makes a tree, but they wouldn't tell you how to paint a tree." Ross was working as a part-time bartender when he discovered a TV show called The Magic of Oil Painting, hosted by German painter Bill Alexander. Alexander touted a 16th century style of painting called alla prima, Italian for first attempt, better known as wet on wet, that allowed him to finish a painting in a little under 30 minutes. Ross studied and became quite good at alla prima through Alexander's show, and began selling Alaskan landscapes painted on the inside of novelty gold mining pans. Eventually, Ross's income from gold pan sales surpassed his military salary. He retired from the Air Force in 1981 with the rank of Master Sergeant after 20 years of service. He first went to Florida and studied painting under Alexander, then joined Alexander Magic Art Supplies Company and became a traveling salesman and tutor. Annette Kowalski, who had attended one of his sessions, became convinced that there was a great opportunity for Ross to succeed on his own, and persuaded him to do so. She invested her life savings in the company, as did Ross and his wife. The business struggled at first. His trademark permed hairstyle came about as a cost-cutting measure when his regular crew-cut haircuts became too expensive. Ross later confessed that he disliked the hairstyle, but did not feel he could change it because it was depicted in the company logo. The origins of the TV show The Joy of Painting are unclear. It was filmed at the studio of the PBS station WIPB in Munkle, Indiana. The show ran from January 11, 1983 to May 17, 1994, but reruns still continue to appear in many broadcast areas and countries, including the non-commercial digital subchannel network Create. During each half-hour segment, Ross would instruct viewers in oil painting using a quick study technique from the imagination that used a limited palette of paints and broke down the process into simple steps. Art critic Mira Shore compared him to Fred Rogers, host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, noting that Ross's soft voice and slow pace of his speech were similar. With help from Annette and Walt Kowalski, Ross built a $15 million business, Bob Ross, Inc., selling his line of art supplies and how-to books, and marketing painting classes taught by instructors trained in the Bob Ross method. All of his income, he said, was derived from those sources. The show was intended to be a vehicle to promote his classes and products. Following Ross's death, ownership of Bob Ross, Inc. was passed to the Kowalskis. Ross also filmed wildlife, squirrels in particular, usually in his garden, and he would often take in injured or abandoned squirrels and other animals. Small animals often appeared on his Joy of Painting canvases. Ross used the wet-on-wet oil painting technique, in which the painter continues adding paint on top of still wet paint rather than waiting a lengthy amount of time to allow each layer of paint to dry. From the beginning, the program kept the selection of tools and colors simple so that viewers would not have to make large investments in expensive equipment. Ross frequently recommended odorless paint thinner, aka odorless mineral spirits, for brush cleaning, combining the wet painting method with the use of large 1 and 2 inch brushes as well as painting knives, allowing Ross to paint trees, clouds, mountains, and water in a matter of seconds. Each painting would start with simple strokes that appeared as nothing more than smudges of color. As he added more and more strokes, the blotches would transform into intricate landscapes. Ross painted 3 versions of almost every painting featured on his show. The first was painted prior to taping and sat on an easel off camera during filming, where Ross used it as a reference to create the second copy, the one viewers actually watched him paint. After filming the episode, Ross painted a more detailed version for inclusion in his instructional books. The different versions were marked as follows on the side or back of the canvases: Kowalski for the initial version, TV for the version painted during the TV show, and book for the book version. Ross dedicated the first episode of the second season of The Joy of Painting to Bill Alexander, explaining that years ago, Bill taught me this fantastic wet-on-wet technique, and I feel as though he gave me a precious gift, and I'd like to share that gift with you, the viewer. As Ross's popularity grew, his relationship with Alexander became increasingly strained. He betrayed me, Alexander told the New York Times in 1991. I invented wet-on-wet. I trained him, and he thinks he can do it better? Art historians have pointed out that wet-on-wet, or alla prima technique, actually originated in Flanders during the 15th century, and was used by Franz Hals, Diego Velázquez, Caravaggio, Paul Cézanne, John Singer Sargent, and Claude Monet, among others. Ross was well known for the catchphrases he used while painting, such as "happy little trees." In most episodes of The Joy of Painting, Ross would note that one of his favorite parts of painting was cleaning the brush. Specifically, he was fond of his method of drying off a brush that he had dipped in odorless thinner by striking it against the can of thinner, then striking a box for early seasons and a trash can on later seasons. Occasionally, he would strike the brush hard on the trash can and say, "Hit the bucket," and then on the easel. He would smile and often laugh aloud as he said, "to beat the devil out of it." He also used the palette that had been lightly sanded down, which was necessary to avoid catching the reflections of the strong studio lighting. Ross wore clothes that he believed would be a timeless look, jeans and a button-down shirt. He also used a minimalist set and spoke as if he were only addressing one viewer. Ross was fond of country music, and in 1987 he was invited on stage by Hank Snow and the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, Tennessee. The audience gave him a huge ovation. He was slightly nervous at first, but felt better after cracking a joke to the crowd. Snow was later given a private painting lesson by Ross. Ross visited New York City to promote his hardcover book, The Best of the Joy of Painting with Bob Ross, and painting techniques to a studio audience several times. On one visit in 1989, he appeared on The Joan Rivers Show. He returned in 1992 for a live show with hosts Regis Philbin and Kathy Lee Gifford. There was one in 1994 when Phil Donahue, who watched his videos and loved his painting technique, invited him to the show to promote his work. Ross took 5 audience members on stage to do a painting, and even Phil himself did a painting and showed it in that episode. In the early 1990s, Ross did several MTV promotional spots that, according to the American City Business Journals, dovetailed perfectly with Generation X's burgeoning obsession with all things ironic and retro. Ross had one son, Stephen Ross, with his first wife, Vivian Ridge. Stephen, also a talented painter, occasionally appeared on The Joy of Painting and became a Ross certified instructor. Stephen appeared on camera in the last episode of Season 1, in which he read a series of general how-to questions sent in by viewers during the season, and Bob answered them one at a time, technique by technique, until he had completed an entire painting. Ross and Ridge's marriage ended in divorce in 1977. Ross and his second wife, Jane, had no children together. In 1992, Jane died of cancer. In 1995, 2 months before his death, Ross married for a third time to Linda Brown. Ross was very secretive about his life and had a great liking for privacy, with only a tight circle of friends. Some of only a few interviews with his close-knit circle of friends and his family can be found in the 2011 PBS documentary, Bob Ross, the Happy Painter. His company, Bob Ross Inc., is protective of his intellectual property and his privacy to this day. Ross died at the age of 52 on July 4, 1995, due to complications from lymphoma, which he had battled for several years. His remains are interred at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Gotha, Florida, under a plaque marked Bob Ross, television artist. Ross kept his diagnosis a secret from the general public, and his lymphoma was not known outside of his circle of family and friends until after his death. And so ends the tale of the famous painter and television personality, Bob Ross, who didn't live happily ever after, but remains among us through his creative works.